My dad said I'd end up a failure until I found a text message from his boss that left him in shock. I don't think there was ever a day growing up when my dad didn't remind me of what a disappointment I was turning out to be. He had a way of making failure feel like it was built into my DNA, like I was born with it stitched across my forehead. Every decision I made, whether it was the classes I picked or the people I chose to hang around, was met with that same tired line, "You'll end up a failure, just wait." He didn't raise his voice much, didn't need to. He said it like it was already a fact written somewhere I hadn't seen yet. He measured my worth against a parade of faces that weren't mine, cousins with medical degrees, neighbors with 9-to-5 jobs and retirement plans, strangers with neat haircuts and pressed colors. Every comparison chipped away at me a little more, but I never showed him that. I stopped trying to explain myself around the time I turned 20. Instead, I buried my energy into something he never asked about, the tech startup I was building from scratch with 2 guys I met in a shared office space downtown. It wasn't flashy yet, and it sure wasn't paying bills in full, but we had an idea, something lean, sharp, and market-ready. We worked in silence, stayed under the radar, and slowly started pulling in interest from the right people. I kept my wins to myself. Not because I was trying to be noble. I just didn't want to hear his usual commentary, that none of it would matter, that it wasn't a real job, that eventually I'd have to face the real world like he did. He had worked his way up in a logistics company, stayed loyal, wore a tie every weekday, and carried a look like life was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. Every time he saw me with my hoodie and laptop, he looked at me like I was wasting oxygen. Then came that night. It was a Wednesday. I'd stopped by for dinner because my mom insisted. She'd cooked one of those meals that probably took her all afternoon, the kind of food that still made me feel 12. We weren't talking much. My dad asked about traffic, barely glanced in my direction otherwise. I didn't bother explaining what I was working on. He didn't ask. Somewhere between clearing plates and dessert, he stepped away to take a call outside, leaving his phone face up on the kitchen counter. I didn't mean to look, not at first. But the screen lit up, and my name was right there in bold in a preview message. I hesitated. Then I tapped it. The message was short, clean, and hit like a punch to the chest. Funny how your failure of a kid just pitched us the idea that could change our whole company. He's got something you clearly never saw. I stood there, phone in hand, staring at those words like they were glowing. His boss had been one of the contacts we'd reached out to for corporate integration, a long shot. Really, and apparently, my recent pitch hadn't just landed, it had cut straight through. I took a screenshot without thinking, then quickly backed out and locked the phone again. He walked in a few seconds later. I didn't say a word. That night, back at my apartment, I printed the screenshot, folded it neatly, slipped it into a plain envelope. No note, no extra words, just the raw truth sealed in paper. The next morning, I drove back to their place earlier than usual. He was already at the table, reading the news and eating his toast the same way he always did, slow, distracted, uninterested in the world around him unless it directly affected him. I set the envelope down beside his plate and sat across from him. He looked at it once, then gave me that skeptical glance like I was wasting his time. But he opened it. He unfolded the paper. Read it. Read it again. His eyes stayed fixed on it longer than I thought they would. His fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the page. He didn't speak. He didn't blink much either. Just stared, as if trying to rewrite the message in his head. And he had no words to throw back. No warning. No dismissive remark. The man who had spent years convincing himself I was headed nowhere suddenly had to confront the fact that I wasn't just surviving, I was being noticed. Not by friends. Not by family. But by the very people he spent his whole life trying to impress. The room was quiet except for the tick of the kitchen clock. I didn't need to say anything. He looked at me once, then looked away. Not out of anger. Not out of pride. Just confusion, like a man who realized too late that he'd missed the moment his son passed him. And I sat there, calm. I didn't smile. Didn't gloat. I just watched him wrestle with the weight of someone else's words, the kind that didn't come from a son trying to prove anything, but from a stranger who had nothing to gain by saying it. I left that envelope on the table. He didn't touch his toast again. He didn't speak to me for 3 days. No call, no text, no message through my mom. I wasn't surprised. That morning, after I slid the envelope across the table, I saw something shift behind his eyes, not anger, not guilt, but something deeper. A kind of quiet confusion, like he didn't know where he stood anymore. And for a man who built his identity on being right, silence was the only move he had left. I didn't reach out either. I'd spent most of my life chasing his approval, explaining myself, trying to justify my direction in ways that always got turned back on me. This time, I let the silence do what words never could. Meanwhile, everything on my end started picking up fast. The pitch I gave his company wasn't just good timing, it was strategic. We'd been watching their operations for months, analyzing weaknesses, looking for angles. Our idea wasn't flashy, but it solved a real problem. Automating their internal freight routing system using our predictive AI engine faster, cheaper, and scalable across regions. It hit exactly where they were bleeding money, and the executive board responded immediately. Meetings were lined up, contracts were drafted, and suddenly, our once scrappy team was being treated like a legitimate tech partner. We didn't celebrate. There wasn't time. We still had to refine the back-end systems, work through prototype glitches, and prep for a full onboarding presentation with their higher-ups. I handled most of the interface design and client communication, the stuff that makes or breaks trust before a deal is signed. The more I worked, the clearer it became that we weren't lucky. We were just quiet for a long time, and now the volume was up. On the 4th day, my mom called. She asked if I could stop by. Her voice was careful, like she was walking on a tightrope between 2 cliffs. I knew what she really meant. He wanted to talk, but he'd never ask directly. That wasn't his style. Pride was still sitting in the middle of the room, refusing to move. I drove over that evening. The sky was low with rain, but it hadn't started yet. Their house looked the same, but I felt different walking in. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I was just done giving weight to his disappointment. He was sitting in the living room. Not watching TV, not reading, just sitting. When I walked in, he nodded slightly, then looked away. My mom offered to make tea, then disappeared into the kitchen like she knew they needed to give us space. There was a long pause before he spoke. So he started, eyes still on the floor, your idea. It's good. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't praise either. It was a fact he couldn't deny anymore. I didn't reply right away. I wanted to see what else he had to say. I saw the follow-up, he added. They're moving fast. A lot faster than I expected. Still no emotion in his voice. Just that flat tone he used when something serious was happening at work. The same voice he used when I got in trouble as a kid, or when bills were tight and he didn't want us to panic. I leaned forward slightly. It's what we've been working on for over a year. We weren't guessing. We had data. He nodded again. I didn't think you were doing anything. That landed heavier than he probably intended. But at least it was honest. You never asked, I said. Not once. He looked up then. I figured if it mattered, you'd bring it up. I didn't respond. That line alone showed me how far apart our definitions of support had always been. He thought silence was neutral. That by not stopping me, he was giving me freedom. But what he didn't understand was that his absence wasn't neutral. It was a weight I carried every day. After a moment, he tried again. Why didn't you say anything earlier? Because every time I did, you shot it down. You didn't just doubt the idea. You doubted me. He didn't argue. Just sat back and let the words hang in the air. The conversation shifted slowly. Not toward warmth, but clarity. He asked questions about the company, who was on the team, how we split equity, how much revenue we'd pulled in last quarter. Real questions, not sarcastic jabs. I answered each one plainly. He listened. He didn't interrupt. It was the first time we spoke like two adults. But just when I thought we'd crossed some invisible threshold, he leaned forward and said something I didn't expect. You know I still think you're taking a big risk, right? I stared at him. And I wouldn't have done it your way. There it was. The core of him. Even now, he couldn't fully let go of that belief that the only correct path was the one he walked. The 9 to 5. The steady check. The climb through corporate ladders until retirement. I could have argued, could have pointed out that his way never inspired me, that his world was one I'd never wanted to inherit. But I didn't. I didn't need him to admit defeat. I just needed him to see that his map wasn't the only one that worked. I know, I said, but your way wasn't mine. He didn't respond. The rest of the evening passed without tension, but without warmth either. We stayed in neutral. My mom rejoined us eventually, and conversation shifted to lighter topics. I didn't stay long. When I left, he walked me to the door. That hadn't happened in years. Still no handshake. No hug. But before I stepped outside, he said something quietly. They're lucky to have heard that pitch before I did. I didn't look back. I just left him there in the doorway, staring into the rain that had finally started falling. Back at the office, the pace picked up even more. Contracts moved to final stages. Our dev team scaled up, bringing in 2 new hires. The onboarding plan turned into a full integration roadmap, and I was tasked with presenting our progress to their executive team, including his direct boss. The meeting was set for the following Monday in their downtown office. I wore a blazer, skipped the hoodie for once. Not for him, for the room I was walking into. The presentation went smooth. I knew my slides, knew the metrics, anticipated their questions before they asked them. When I showed the projected savings across the company's supply chain, heads nodded. A few even smiled. But it wasn't until the CTO leaned back and said, "We want to roll this out company-wide," that I saw it, the shift in posture across the table. The deal wasn't just landing, it was being fast-tracked. Afterward, as people gathered their things, his boss approached me. Firm handshake. A nod of approval. Then he said, "He ever tell you how surprised he was when he realized it was his own kid pitching this?" I raised an eyebrow. "He thought you were one of the outside hires we brought in. Didn't recognize your name on the initial reports." That hit harder than anything he'd said to my face. I left the building feeling weightless and heavy all at once. That night, I didn't go home. I drove straight to their house. I didn't call first. I didn't bring a printout this time. He was in the garage when I arrived, tinkering with some old tools he never used anymore. I walked up, stood by the doorway. He looked at me, surprised but not angry. "Everything okay?" "We signed the deal," I said. He nodded slowly. I heard. "They're expanding it across the board. Full integration." "I know," he said, setting the wrench down. "They're already talking about restructuring around it." I waited, but he didn't say more. "You didn't recognize my name on the pitch reports," I said, watching his reaction closely. He didn't flinch, just sighed. "I didn't expect to see it there," he admitted. "Didn't think I had a reason to look for it." And finally, I understood. This wasn't about malice. It wasn't about him wanting me to fail. It was that he'd built a version of me in his head that stopped growing years ago. A version that froze in high school, stuck in the shadow of cousins and neighbors, never catching up. He hadn't updated that image in his mind. Not because he didn't care, because he didn't believe it could change. "I'm not that kid anymore," I said. He looked up. "I see that now." For a long time, we stood there. Not as father and son locked in years of resentment, but as 2 people finally standing on level ground. The silence didn't feel like distance anymore. It felt like space. Room to rebuild. Room to speak plainly. Room to stop fighting over who was right and start seeing who we'd both become. And though I said nothing else before walking away that night, I knew something had shifted. Not just in him. In me. The official rollout happened 3 months later. By then, the entire company had restructured its logistics division around our system. The implementation was fast because the numbers spoke for themselves. Reduced overhead, faster delivery times, and a sharp cut in routing errors. What began as a prototype pitched in a small meeting room now powered the backbone of a national operation. We didn't just land a client, we built a partnership. And people beyond our circles started noticing. Industry articles called us a disruptive solution with real-world application. A few interviews followed. I didn't mention my dad in any of them. Not out of spite, he simply wasn't part of the narrative we'd created. He wasn't there for the all-nighters, the failed builds, or the investor rejections. He wasn't on the calls when we thought we'd lose everything. That part belonged to my team. Still, I thought about him more often than I expected. Not because I needed approval anymore, that had faded, but because something in him had changed after the deal closed. He didn't start showering me with praise or pretending he'd always believed in me. That wasn't his nature. But he stopped undermining me. He stopped assuming I was a mistake waiting to happen. That shift, quiet as it was, mattered. I kept my distance out of habit, but visits became more frequent. Dinners weren't tense. Conversations stayed even. He asked about projects without skepticism. He didn't always understand the work, but he listened. And that was more than I ever expected from him. Then came the unexpected call. His boss, the same one who sent the message that started this all, reached out and asked if I'd be interested in leading a joint innovation unit. A small task force combining our startup's agility with their corporate reach. It was the kind of offer that didn't just boost a resume, it opened doors across the industry. I told him I'd think about it. Not because I was unsure about the opportunity, but because I knew what it meant. Taking the role would bring me into the company my dad spent 30 years in. Into the same halls where he built his reputation. And while it wasn't about stepping into his shadow, it felt like walking into a space where our paths would finally intersect. I didn't tell him right away. Instead, I asked him to meet me, just him, no mom, no dinner table, no distractions. We met at a park near their neighborhood, a place we used to visit when I was a kid. I remembered the benches, the path by the pond, the old rusted water fountain still somehow working. He arrived on time, wearing the same windbreaker he always wore on cool days. We walked a bit before I spoke. They offered me a lead position, I said, to head a joint unit between our company and yours. He looked at me, surprised but not shocked. You thinking about taking it? I already accepted. He nodded. Then it's the right move. I stopped walking. You sure about that? He turned, understanding what I meant. Look, I don't pretend to know everything you're doing. But what I've seen, it works. And not just for business. It's working for you. That matters more than whether or not I understand it. It was the closest thing to approval I'd ever get from him. And it was enough. We sat on the bench. Quiet stretched between us, but it didn't feel strained. I asked him how things were at work. He said the company was shifting, leaning into new strategies they once resisted. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell it unsettled him. After 3 decades of routines, innovation felt like unfamiliar ground. And now his son was part of that shift. Does it bother you? I asked. That I'm coming into the same space? He shook his head slowly. It used to, but not anymore. You didn't take my path, you built your own and still ended up in the same room. That says something. A week later, I officially stepped into the new role. The workspace was separate from their main offices by design to give us freedom to operate without corporate drag. I built my team from scratch again, pulling a mix of internal talent and external hires. And slowly, the bridge between both worlds started forming. He never interfered. He didn't walk in to check on me. He didn't try to guide or question decisions. But I knew he watched from a distance. I saw it in the way others mentioned him, how he'd bring up projects I was leading, how he spoke with a different tone now when my name came up. Months passed. The unit grew. Our results started influencing company policy. Suddenly, departments were consulting us before launching new initiatives. I wasn't a novelty anymore. I was a decision maker. Then came the board review. Every department head was scheduled to present their quarter progress. It wasn't a public event, but enough eyes were in the room to make the stakes clear. I prepared for weeks, ran numbers, tested frameworks, rehearsed points with my team. The night before, I stayed late in the office, reviewing every slide until it felt locked. As I left, I saw him in the hallway, briefcase in hand, on his way out too. We hadn't run into each other in the building until that moment. He nodded. I nodded back. You ready? He asked. I am. He paused, then said, You don't need to prove anything in there. Just show them what you've built. And that was all. The next morning, I walked into the boardroom without nerves, presented our results clearly, answered questions with precision. By the end, the head of operations, someone I'd only seen in meetings, never spoken to directly, said our work would be integrated into the company's long-term planning. The room agreed. No debate. Later, as people filed out, my dad passed me in the hallway. "Good work," he said quietly. "You made it clear." He didn't stay for small talk. He didn't have to. That moment held everything that once felt unreachable, respect not given out of obligation, but earned from impact. After that, our relationship settled into something steady. Not close in the way some fathers and sons are, but solid. If we disagreed, we said so. If we didn't understand each other, we asked. The tension that once filled every room we shared had faded. Not erased, but dissolved into something manageable. Years passed. My company expanded beyond the partnership. We launched tools for other industries, hired bigger, scaled wider. He retired 2 years after I took the lead role. Quiet exit. No big party. Just a note on the company site thanking him for his time. He started stopping by the new office sometimes. Not often. Just to say hello. He'd bring coffee, sometimes ask how things were going. Never stayed long. Then one day, he handed me an old envelope. I opened it. Inside was the same screenshot I'd printed and given him years ago, the message from his boss. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear. "You kept this?" I asked. He nodded. I didn't want to forget the moment I had to stop assuming things about you. There was nothing more to say. No long speech. No emotional outburst. Just two men sitting with the weight of years that finally made sense. Eventually, I framed that paper. Not for others to see. Just for myself, a reminder that silence can hold answers, and that even those who never believed in you can change. Not because they're forced to, but because truth has a way of making itself undeniable. And that's where the story ends, not with a dramatic twist, not with a final battle, but with clarity. The man who once told me I'd fail had to watch me build what he never saw coming. And I didn't need to shout. I just had to keep going.